Hi everyone, this is Dr. Young. Um, this is Intro to Africa at Flagler College. Today we want to cover some other regions in the 19th century. The previous lecture, of course, was on kind of the basics of the 19th century, especially when it comes to African agency, as well as talking about North Africa. Now, talking about West Africa, I want to refer back to something that we've already discussed in the class, and that is the spread of Islam, the way that happened, kind of, beginning in the 9th or 10th century, probably with the Kingdom of Ghana. But Islam, of course, spread via the trans-Saharan trade routes. The merchants, mostly Berbers, who had converted to Islam in the north part of Africa, took the religion with them across the Sahara, shared it with the people they were trading with, especially the elites like the kings of Ghana and Mali and Songhai and some of these other empires. And the political leaders of these West African kingdoms often borrowed some portions of Islam, some of the things they liked, that they then created a syncretic form of Islam, mixing in traditional religious ideas and religious practices. And to some extent, that was still the case in the 19th century. There were, of course, very long established and prestigious institutions of Islamic learning in West Africa, especially in the Sahel region, the upper bend of the Niger. We looked at the Great Mosque of Djenné, for instance, talked about Timbuktu and some of these other places. But during the slave trade, there were Muslim rulers and Muslim merchants still, trading in slaves, and that syncretic form of the religion continued, often being transported across large distances with the slave trade as Muslim Africans were captured and sold into slavery. And so, slavery leads to the diffusion of the religion across a wider expanse, but not necessarily to a form that moves beyond the syncretism. Now, the desire to have, and that's not to say that Islamic scholars didn't see problems with the syncretic form of the religion. There was almost certainly some who fought against this. But those in power tended, even if they were Islam, tended to embrace a syncretic form of the religion. That changes in the 19th century, and it changes for a number of reasons. One of these is the spreading of ideas of a militant form of jihad. Now, that may sound redundant. After all, jihad is the Arabic word for, usually translated as holy war, right, or a war for God or something like that. But the meaning of jihad changes, according to the interpreter within Islam. The idea of jihad is this struggle against the infidel, the thing that animates, terrorist groups and things like that, is really more of a modern phenomenon and a kind of fringe outlier to the standard reading of jihad. But there is such a reading present in the early 19th century, or something akin to it, right? That there were Muslim leaders, clerics for the most part, who began to exercise political power, place themselves at the heads of armies, really kind of formulated jihad along these very militaristic lines, and managed to seize control of large territories. Now, in doing so, they disrupted the, in some ways kind of dealt the final death blow to the, well, I shouldn't say that. They disrupted the existing political structures, most of which were still kind of formulated around the slave trade, the extraction of peoples from the interior of Africa and the trading of them southwards to the coastline, to the European slave ports. The Bambara kingdoms of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, for instance, were especially the kingdom of Segu, otherwise known as the Bambara Empire, in roughly what is now Mali, kind of the eastern part of Mali, is one of the best examples of this. Islam was definitely present in Segu. The ruler of Islam the ruler of Segu had Islamic advisors, and probably gave lip service to the religion. May have, done some things to appease his Muslim subjects, but his form of the religion was syncretic. Well, this was an abomination to some Islamic clerics who began to seize control in the early 19th century. Now, the key to, the most important outgrowth of these jihadi movements was the political entity known as the Sokoto Caliphate. It's important to understand the impact of the term caliphate. Caliph in early Islam, of course, was the successor to Muhammad, the religious and political leader of the Islamic Ummah or community. Islamic lore has it, Islamic history, I should say, although some of it is almost certainly mythology, has it that, after Muhammad, there were four rightly guided, the Arabic word is Rashidun, rightly guided caliphs. And after that, things kind of got more complicated, and there were some caliphs who exercised authority that was illegitimate. Now, the desire to get back to that original 7th century caliphate has been a strong and recurring one in the history of Islam in different regions of the world. And so the leaders of the movement that culminated in the establishment of the Sokoto Caliphate were inspired by that model, right, where the caliph was the supreme religious and political leader, that those were combined in this person, and that he ruled his kingdom through his agents who were known as emirs, okay, and that they would, be both religious and political leaders. But the caliph, that all supreme authority would culminate in the caliph himself. Now, sorry for the yawn there. The catalyst that kind of spurred the creation of the Sokoto Caliphate was, first of all, the unification of the different microstates that made up Hausa land. That's over here, in the kind of northeastern part of what is now Nigeria. The Niger-Benue confluence here, and north of that. This is all known as Hausa land. Then as now, to some extent, actually. The Hausa and Fulani peoples, who were at least nominally Muslim for centuries before this. There was an Islamic cleric among the Hausa as they were kind of unifying as a people, named Usman Dan Fodio. He led the jihadi armies to, first of all, conquer a great deal of territory, to fully unify Hausa land, and even to fight against some of their neighbors, including the Bambara Empire, or Segu, and to push back the boundaries to a fairly wide extent here. You can see they controlled a fairly large amount of territory, right? And the Sokoto Caliphate was a tremendously successful experiment in Islamic government. However, we could also say, politically at least, it had some weaknesses or some things that made it less effective than it might otherwise have been. Even though Usman Dan Fodio was the guiding force of this whole creation of the Sokoto Caliphate, as soon as the work was done, as it were, he was not much interested in governing. He was a cleric, after all. He was interested in being a religious leader, and spending his time doing theology rather than governing. And so he turned a lot of the day-to-day governing over to his lieutenants, or his agents, called the emirs. And so the Sokoto Caliphate was made, it was nominally led by the caliph, but the real power was exercised on a kind of local and regional level, was exercised by these figures called the emirs. And so their territories would be known as emirates, right? Now, under the Emirates, there were, and these often ran through kinship networks, there were nobles related to the emirs who controlled a lot of land and a lot of slaves, and pretty much their economy was an agricultural slave economy. As well as the Fulbe, as they were known, the Fulbe nobles were able to take greatest advantage of the trans-Saharan trade. Their agricultural produce, though, the things that they also traded from with peoples further to the south, the Fulbe nobles were the ones who reaped the largest benefits from all of this. And the Sokoto Caliphate was in existence from the first decade of the 19th century until the Europeans began to interfere in large numbers and with real intent kind of in this area in the last quarter of the 19th century. Though it was weakened over the decades, most effective early on, and more and more the nobles were the ones who controlled the power, and the caliph was really just kind of this titular figure in all of this. All right, let's move on to South Africa, or Southern Africa, and really this is to some extent a history of the country of South Africa, which is unique in all of African history. There's nothing quite like it. I suppose that's probably the case for just about every region or every nation in Africa. It has its own unique history. But South Africa is particularly unique in that it has been inhabited by European peoples continuously from the middle of the 17th century until today. And so the level of European involvement, and not just Europeans there to trade, as happened in other parts, to trade and to try to convert the natives to Christianity, as happened in other parts of Africa. This was a much more invasive and permanent kind of habitation that the Europeans had there. This starts with the Dutch East India Company in the middle of the 17th century. This was arguably the world's first super corporation, massive business interests. And the Dutch East India Company was so powerful, in fact, that, and this is, let's remember, in the days before, kind of strong European states emerged. It's the Dutch East India Company because its headquarters was in the Netherlands, which itself was kind of a newly independent, newly formed territory, an outgrowth of the kind of the chaos of the Reformation period in Europe. But the Dutch East India Company was not it was not controlled by the Dutch government. Okay. The company was an independent entity that had many of the powers that we would otherwise attribute to states, to nations, to countries. The Dutch East India Company could make its own treaties. It had a military wing. It fought wars. They controlled their own colonies. And so in 1652, under the leadership of a guy named Jan van Riebeck, who was an employee of the Dutch East India Company, a company ship landed at Table Mountain on the southwest tip of the Cape of Good Hope. And they decided that this would be an excellent location. It's a really beautiful spot, first of all, but that this would be an excellent location to have a permanent colony, so that, for understandable reasons, right? The Dutch East India Company made a lot of its money, not the entirety. Actually, they were more involved in things like the herring trade in the Baltic Sea. That was possibly the most lucrative part of their business. But they were increasingly involved in trying to extract spices from places like Southeast Asia and Indonesia. And so they needed a place where their boats could stop and take on provisions and make repairs And so they set up a permanent colony and called it simply Cape Town. All right, so this is the beginning of the establishment of Cape Town. Now, all of the inhabitants initially of Cape Town were company employees. And they were beholden in just about every way to the company. They had to, the stores were owned by the company, the houses were built by the company. Cape Town was a company town for some time. But increasingly, as the decades passed, and some of these, employees of the company became disgruntled with the terms under which they lived in Cape Town, they decided to strike out on their own and to try to claim land outside of Cape Town and, set up farms. And to do so, of course, they enslaved a lot of the local population, the native population. The natives in that part of southern Africa were mostly these people known as the Khoikhoi, who were a mix of Bantu herdsmen and the Khoisan peoples, who were originally native to this area. They were pastoralists because the western part of South Africa is very dry, particularly as you move further north into the Kalahari and the Namib deserts. And so it's very dry. It does not support a lot of agriculture, but it is good for cattle raising. And these mostly Dutch, but some German and eventually some French settlers, former employees of the Dutch East India Company, and they, historically they tend to go by the name Boers. Boer means farmer in Dutch, and eventually in the modified form of Dutch known as Afrikaans. And so Boer is really kind of the name given to these people. They carved out for themselves farms and ranches in the Cape region, independent of what the Dutch East India Company was doing there. And over the course of the 18th century, the Dutch East India Company was eclipsed by the British East India Company, which and ultimately by the newly formed British Empire, we might call it. And the British began to take an interest not only in Cape Town, but in all of South Africa itself. And these Boer settlers were not thrilled about that. They didn't want to be controlled, and they knew that the British would come in and try to exert some political control over the inhabitants of the area. The British also, especially as the 18th century wore on, were looking more and more like they were going to go for abolition. And the Boers were not particularly thrilled about this because their livelihood depended on the control of slaves. And so they moved further and further to the east. Now, there's this long process, and I don't want to go through all the details here. I do teach an upper division course on the history of South Africa where I could go a lot more into detail on this. If you're interested, come take that class sometime. But the British eventually kind of seized control of Cape Town, and the Boers moved further and further away from that, and the British kind of chased them. There are British settlers too who take an interest in South Africa and want to have their own farms and things, and so as the British are expanding out of Cape Town to the east, the Boers are moving also to the east to get away from the British and into native territory. Now, they eventually run into some fairly populated areas with fairly well-organized Bantu groups like the Xhosa over here, east of Port Elizabeth, right? Or actually, they were a little bit west of that originally. And this leads to a series of wars in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And European missionaries also begin to take an interest in this area, especially trying to preach to the Xhosa people. And so missionaries land here and kind of set up mission stations on the kind of the tip of South Africa there. So lots happening with European settlement, right? Now, as all of that's getting underway, as the Boers and the British are moving further and further to the east and pushing against the Xhosa, in the early 19th century, there was a massive outbreak of rinderpest, this cattle disease among the Xhosa. And this is one of the things that effectively makes them, lose out to the European settlers, and eventually to kind of cede much of their territory. Most of the best farmland that they had controlled was passed into European hands, whether the Boers or the British. Um, Further to the east, though, there were some pretty monumental things happening. Okay, and this process, which is known by the Zulu word mfekane. Actually, I think that's the Xhosa word or the Ndebele word for it. Those are all very related languages. Anyway, they're the Nguni languages of the Nguni branch of the Bantu language family. But in any case, the Mfekane, as it's called, the scattering or the movements of peoples, massive disruption created initially by the military adventures of a group who had existed previous to this time, but really didn't coalesce until they were inspired by their leader named Shaka. This is the Zulu people. Okay, so Shaka Zulu is one of the most important figures in all of the history of Southern Africa. A really interesting, enigmatic figure, but he was the kind of the spur to this whole process of events that we call the Mfekane. All right. Now this is complicated, so I'm going to try to simplify and break this down as much as I possibly can. Right. First of all, why was Shaka an effective military leader? Well, he came up with a number of military innovations, some of which took advantage of pre-existing conceptions or pre-existing institutions in the society. For instance, the Zulu, many of the peoples of Southern Africa, as other parts of the continent, had age rank systems where people of a certain age were given specific tasks within the society and performed specific functions. Well, Shaka organized his army around this age rank system. And this was effective. It gave people defined things to do, really sort of cemented their identity as a warrior in Shaka's army with this specific task assigned to their age rank, right? And so he was able to achieve a level of military organization that simply had not existed previous to this time, but it went further than that. Shaka introduced some innovations in terms of weapons and strategies and tactics that really had never been seen in Southern Africa, or not really too many places otherwise in Africa. And I wish that I could draw a diagram of this, okay? He invented this formation known as the bull's horns. Okay, so if you can envision the head of a bull with horns, he would have a group of warriors in the center facing their enemy, and then he would send some of his best warriors around to both sides in an enveloping maneuver of the enemy. Now, that sounds fairly normal, right? So for a long time, military strategy was all about flanking maneuvers and trying to get around your enemy, attacking them from the rear and such, or from multiple sides. But it's difficult to overstate how innovative this was for African military ventures. African wars were largely symbolic things up to this point in history. Okay, and I'm really hyper-generalizing here. There are certainly parts of Africa that did, North Africa, for instance, had the great General Hannibal back in the Roman days, who used plenty of flanking maneuvers and lots of innovative stuff. So this is not general to add to the whole of Africa, right? But in many parts of Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, warfare was largely symbolic. It was a show of strength and a show of courage, a demonstration of courage and might, where the best, fittest, most honorable men in a society, in a Kafu in West Africa, for instance, or in a village or a collection of villages in Central Africa, would send out their best warriors, um, often decked out in kind of symbolic, ritualized military garb, and you'll read about some of this in Things Fall Apart. Okay, next week, where Okonkwo, the leader or one of the leaders of Umuofia, the main character of the story, he's contemplating the wars of the past, and he talks about that they fought this war against this other collection of villages, and that the war only it only lasted for like 3 weeks or something like that, and or 2 weeks or whatever it was. And he says, they eventually sued for peace because we killed 12 of their men and they only killed 2 of ours. Well, those are pretty low casualty numbers, right? Hinting that warfare was largely symbolic. If, as soon as the other army, the enemy knocked off a few of your guys, you're like, the village might say, well, we don't want to lose any more of them, so let's sue for peace. We're willing to make terms with them and give up some things so that we stop fighting, right? Well, that was, and for Southern Africa, and we can see this from the little bit of documentation we have about how the Zulus fought and about how their enemies fought. When the Zulu moved against the Xhosa, for instance, it seems that the Xhosa did what they normally did in warfare, which was send up a few of their soldiers, and a few of their warriors, possibly again decked out in kind of ritualized garb with masks and large headdresses and things, and they would throw these long spears at their enemies, and perhaps they would hit somebody once in a while if they were good at aiming, right? But it was again just kind of a show of force and a demonstration of courage. Well, Shaka armed his soldiers, and again, they're organized in these age rank systems. He's got them flanking their enemies. He also armed them with a short stabbing spear. In other words, the point was not to hurl a spear as far as they could and see if it hit somebody, but rather to move in close to the enemy and stab them, and with an intent to do damage, to kill the enemy, maybe even in large numbers, right? And so all of these military innovations sort of coalesced in Shaka's campaigns, and he carved out a large territory for the Zulu, at the expense of the Xhosa, the expense of several other groups in the area. There was another group called the Undebele, for instance, and you can see this from the map here, right? That this area was called Zululand. This was really the heartland of Shaka's power. He sent several groups kind of packing, moving even long distances because they simply could not fight against the power of these Zulu armies. And this in turn gave the Zulu an even greater sense of their strength and their identity. Those who were able to joined with the Zulu, who were able to be kind of incorporated or assimilated into them. And so the Zulu group grew by those means as well. They carved out a fairly large kingdom for themselves here, and in the process sent the Ndebele across. Now, this is not a physical map, but remember there's a mountain range that runs right through here, right? The Drakensberg. And they sent the Ndebele across the mountains up here into the Highveld Plateau of what later came to be known as the Transvaal. Same thing with the Shoshangane and the Swazi, who were inhabitants of these areas, and the Zulu sort of pushed them to the north. In the case of the Shoshangane, they went all the way up into what is now Mozambique. Same thing, with groups like the Xhosa and the Sutu. And Shaka is not the only one, by the way, who exercised effective leadership during this time. Another important one is King Moshoeshoe. You're probably looking at this saying Moshushu, right? Moshoeshoe is how you pronounce that. The OE sound in Bantu languages makes a way. It's pronounced way. So, and the single O is pronounced like a double O, at least in Southern African languages that I'm acquainted with. So, Moshoeshoe. Anyway, pronunciation doesn't really matter, right? This is why it's also called the Sutu, not the Sotho, and why the country is Lesotho instead of Lesotho. In any case, Moshoeshoe managed to sort of create a mountain stronghold here, where they were able to fend off invasions from the Zulu, and eventually from the Boers, from the Afrikaners, coming into the same area. Moshoeshoe is incredibly effective as a leader, really working in defensive and diplomatic ways rather than military ways. Now, Shaka was murdered at the height of his power by rival claimants to the throne, including his own brother, Dingane. He may have been involved in the murder of Shaka. A good mob story really doesn't even, might be a good kind of analogy to this, right? But, the damage had already been done, and the Zulu continued to press their advantage and to move into other places. Now, it gets even more disruptive, because right around the same time, starting in the 1830s, 1840s, as the Zulu, now under Dingane, were continuing to attack their neighboring peoples and to carve out more and more territory. And you get these other people who have moved into these other regions and are trying to establish their power there. There's even one group, by the way, before I forget to say this, one group of Nguni-speaking peoples who they travel all the way up, like north of Malawi, up into the Great Lakes region. That's how far they went to get away from the chaos caused by the Zulu. So the Mfecane creates this massive disruption of peoples, and also really establishes a lot of these sort of tribal or kinship identities that remain all the way to the present. Now, further disruption is created when, in order to get away from the British, who eventually just declare this whole region down here to be a British colony called Cape Colony, okay? A group of Afrikaners, well, not just one group, but starting with one and then, several other groups following, decided to pack up everything that they owned because they wanted to get away from the British, and they moved. They, in covered wagons or hand carts or whatever they could build for themselves, they drove, herded their cattle and their horses and things across the Drakensberg, up here, really kind of around the Drakensberg, up here into this area called that they called the Transvaal. The area, the Trans means across. The Fall River's down here. Okay, so across the Fall River. Some of them stayed further to the south here, and some of them, even kind of broke into the mountain fastnesses that were controlled by Moshoeshoe's Sutu people. They took over parts of the Caledon River Valley here, for instance. These are known as the Voortrekkers, and I tried to give enough of an Afrikaans accent to that, right? The Voortrekkers, voor means before or early, right? So the before trekkers, the early trekkers, the first trekkers. We would use the word pioneers, probably. And in fact, this is the very same era, even the same years, that many of that much of the westward expansion of the U.S. was really starting to get going. The California Gold Rush was 1849, began in 1849. The Mormon pioneers, made it to what became Salt Lake City in 1847. The Oregon Trail was really just getting going in this period. And so the Voortrekkers are contemporaries of those American pioneers who settled much of the western United States. And we should see them with the same equipment, probably dressed similarly, speaking a different language certainly, but it's the same kind of era. Now, the Voortrekkers got into the Transvaal and into this area west of the Drakensberg, which came to be called the Orange Free State. And they realized that the better land was down here across the mountains into this region called Natal, or Zululand. And so for a time, they actually crossed the border or crossed over the mountains. A few of them did at least, and they fought this massive battle against the Zulu called the Battle of Blood River. And a group of just a couple hundred four-trekkers ended up holding off a massive Zulu army with guns and cannons. They circled their wagons, and they managed to preserve their lives while taking down huge numbers of Zulus. Now, this would be repeated several times, actually. The British would eventually fight a massive battle that's gone down, kind of famous in history, against the Zulu, too. But it turns out that even the highly effectively organized Zulu were no match for these European firearms. However, the Zulu had already opened up pretty secure communication with the British, as, by the way, had Mushweshwe up here in the mountains. And in order to protect their, well, ostensibly to protect their Zulu and Sotho allies, but really to advance British interests and not let these Dutch and German, Afrikaans settlers have these good lands as they saw it. Once the Voortrekkers crossed into Natal and fought against the Zulu and looked like they were going to take over large parts of Zululand, the British simply declared that whole area to be a colony called Natal, British Natal. And so now the British created two colonies, Cape Colony and Natal. And in response to that, the Voortrekkers packed up and moved back across the Drakensberg up here into the Transvaal, and didn't, make an effort to try to get along with the British. They wanted to get away from the British. Now, they did attack the Sotho and also the Ndebele. Ndebele were eventually forced to cross the Limpopo River and began to settle here in the southern part of what is now Zimbabwe, pushing the Shona peoples further to the north, and so more and more disruption. But both the Swazi and the Sotho, were victimized to some extent by these Voortrekkers, and so via diplomatic communications with the British declared protectorates, and I'll explain what a protectorate is next week. But essentially, a territory that the British, have some interest in that they say is under their protection. They declare a protectorate over what they called Basotho land and also over Swaziland. And they would eventually do this over Bechuana land, as it was called, or what later becomes called Botswana. Right. So the Voortrekkers contribute to the chaos of the Mfecane, and this leaves peoples who had been fairly concentrated there in that Natal region now scattered all over southern Africa and even points beyond that. So the British have now created two colonies. In response to the creation of the two British colonies, these Dutch Boer settlers, the Voortrekkers, then declare the existence of two independent republics. The Transvaal, which is this area north of the Fall River here, all the way up to the Limpopo, and the Orange Free State, which is this area just to the west of Lesotho, kind of over here into the, infringing on the Cape region. There is a map here. You can see what this looks like by the 1890s. We've got these two independent Afrikaner republics, and then we have the Cape Colony and Natal, and then the protectorates of Bechuanaland, British Bechuanaland, Swaziland, and Basotho land. There is one other key development, and I'll leave this for a time. We'll pick up South Africa eventually. This is going to be one of the examples we take all the way through the rest of the course. In the early 1870s, diamonds were discovered in the northeastern Cape region. Okay, so right about here, right on the borderline, really, between the Cape and the Orange Free State. And in fact, I think both the British and the Voortrekkers claimed that territory. But diamonds were discovered. The British swoop in and declare that this is part of the Cape Colony. This is really the reason why they moved beyond this coastline, because there's not much else up here. It's pretty dry, not arable land necessarily. But Diamonds are discovered, massive diamond deposits are discovered in this place that comes to be called Kimberley. And huge fortunes. So this is, similar in some ways to the California or the Yukon gold rush. California much earlier than Yukon, I guess. Yukon was in the 1890s. Except that it probably produced, vastly more wealth than either of those gold rushes did. And this has a complicated history that I'm not going to go into. Initially, there were individual claims, so some English, some British, some Afrikaners, and some native Africans even were able to stake claims. These claims often were only maybe a few meters in diameter, but anything that, I suppose theoretically ran from there to the center of the earth, could be claimed by them. And so, huge. This becomes a boomtown, huge mining project by hundreds, if not thousands, of adventurers trying to get rich by digging for diamonds. But when most of the claims simply didn't produce anything, there were a few land speculators who gradually bought up much of the land in Kimberley and formed companies, large stock companies out of this. The most successful company to emerge from the Kimberley diamond rush was the De Beers Company. Now, if you've never heard that word before, eventually you will, especially if you want to get married someday and are interested in buying a diamond ring. Okay. Not necessarily, I suppose that's not absolutely necessary for a marriage, but it tends to be traditional, right? You almost certainly will have to deal with the De Beers Company at some point. They control, by far the largest share of all of the diamonds in the world, from via their headquarters in London. And one of the founding partners of the De Beers Company, by the way, was a fellow named Cecil Rhodes, and he's another person we will come back to in due course here. Okay, he becomes eventually the governor of Cape Colony and one of the leading figures in the second part of the 19th century. He's also the one who spearheads the establishment of colonies further to the north, and what comes to be called Rhodesia after him, right after his name. All right, sorry if that was too much detail. South Africa is the place I probably know the most about in Africa, so we can delve into a lot of that. Last, East Africa, and then we'll leave this subject of kind of Africa in the first three quarters of the 19th century. East Africa from the 16th century on sees a great deal of Portuguese intervention, and this disrupts the Arab monopoly on trade along the east coast of Africa, leads to the destruction in some cases or the takeover by the Portuguese of some of these key trading ports, like especially Sofala in the south. But in response to this Portuguese intervention, there's also a kind of step up in Arab activity. In the 19th century, there was a kingdom, and I think this may go back to the 18th century actually too, but there was a kingdom in South Arabia called Oman, the forerunner of the modern nation of Oman. And in the 19th century, the leader of Oman decided that the most lucrative part of his kingdom was, in fact, not southern Arabia, but the lands that he controlled on the east coast of Africa. And so he himself, the ruler of Oman, moved his capital down to the island of Zanzibar. And Zanzibar emerged in this period as a highly productive trading center, and via Zanzibar, the Omani kings also began to take an interest in the interior of the continent, not just for the goods that could be produced, but also to control it politically and thus, not have to deal with the middlemen who were bringing goods to the coast from the interior. And he did this through a variety of means. He sent mostly adventurers, military adventurers, into the interior of the continent, where they carved out territory, claimed it for Oman. Some of them ended up acting in semi-independent ways and sort of carved out their own little territories that they ruled more or less independently. There's a figure who went by the nickname Tipu Tip. That was supposed to be the sound of the rifles of his soldiers firing. That's why he was given that name. But Tipu Tip was this tremendously powerful warlord who extended Omani rule into the interior of what is now Tanzania and Kenya, and controlled a lot of slaves and a lot of land himself. Now, Zanzibar initially was largely a slave trading area, but also very active in the trade in ivory. And so Tipu Tip and other adventurers like him also went into the interior to, procure slaves directly via warfare, and to kill elephants in order to, gain their tusks and take them out, trade them as ivory. Now, they did bring things into the interior like cloth and firearms, which they traded for slaves and ivory and some of these other things. And so the trade in cloth and firearms continued in ways that were similar to what was happening on the west coast of Africa during the transatlantic slave trade. But this intervention into the interior was never entirely stable. And eventually the island of Zanzibar proved to be really the best place in the world to grow cloves. By the mid-19th century, I think clove plantations had grown up all over the island. And even today, Zanzibar produces, the majority of the world's cloves, if not the vast majority of them. I'm not sure of the exact statistics there, but I know that Zanzibar grows a lot of cloves. Now these clove plantations were worked mostly by slaves, right? So we have here an illustration from a 19th century source where we've got these slaves probably with their baskets of cloves that they've harvested from the trees on their heads. This really put a lot of money into the coffers of the Omani rulers. Eventually, Britain would take a real interest in this, and this would be one of the places that it laid claim to, though the Germans did too for a time, as we'll see. Now, this extension of the power of the Omani kingdom did disrupt the interior, as did Portuguese intervention and the work of European missionaries. And so, among other things happening in the interior in the Great Lakes region, let's remember we have these fairly large, powerful kingdoms like Bunyoro and Buganda and Rwanda, Burundi. All of these going back into the 17th and 18th centuries, probably. Well, Bunyoro was nearly taken over by the early 19th century by Buganda. So Bunyoro was to the west, Buganda right on the north shore of Lake Victoria, the country that is now called Uganda, of course. But Buganda was disrupted far more by this, this activity from coastal settlements than was Bunyoro. It took the brunt of a lot of that. There were also a lot of powerful people, nobles in Buganda, who converted to Christianity and used their Christian identity as a way to criticize the king of Buganda. And eventually this eroded his power a great deal. They said, "We're Christian, we don't have to listen to you, you're a pagan." And so this was also disruptive. This may have been opportunistic on their part, but for whatever reason, this really kind of weakened Buganda, which had been nearly to the point of establishing a much larger empire. And Bunyoro, to the west, was the beneficiary of the now weakened state of Buganda. Another disruptive element were these Nguni refugees fleeing the Mfecane, who moved up, around Lake Malawi, and this caused some further, disruptions in that area. These Nguni refugees tried to carve out that territory militarily. In Rwanda, we have the increasing tendency, though still not anywhere close to cemented or crystallized in place, of identities cohering with these ethnic identifiers, or these ethnic terms like Hutu and Tutsi. For the most part, Tutsi means pastoralist and Hutu means farmer, agriculturalist. And there was plenty of fluidity between the two groups, plenty of intermarriage, plenty of Tutsi who married Hutus, or vice versa. Tutsi or pastoralists who were down on their luck decided to take up farming, right? So this was not something that is kind of time out of mind. These identities were very, very fluid. Now, in the end of the 20th century with the Rwandan genocide, the Hutu in particular were insistent that the Tutsi had exploited and governed them with cruelty for centuries. But these identities were definitely not firmly in place at this point, though they were becoming more and more of a reality in Rwanda. The Tutsi the pastoralists did control the lion's share of the power. The king of Rwanda was a pastoralist, was a Tutsi. Much of his bureaucracy, his leading officials were Tutsi. But again, lots of fluidity among the common people. There was a lot, with the abolition of the slave trades and, the massive effects that had on the west coast of Africa. The Great Lakes region sees a pretty serious uptick in slavery, partly because the western coast of Africa is no longer supplying slaves to the world market, but also because of these increased activities of the Omani rulers, and some other factors in all of that. Now, Swahili as a language continues to develop. I think I've talked about that, right? It really becomes set in stone as the great lingua franca of this whole region of Africa, the whole central part of Africa, though it's not necessarily anyone's first language. It's the language they use to communicate with each other. And so that's one of the things that lends itself to the interaction between peoples, both for trade and for military reasons. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about really the first 3 quarters of the 19th century. I've given you a few case studies here. And if you have questions or you want to ask about other parts of Africa or something, feel free to do that on the discussion boards. Next week we will move on and talk about European colonialism and the effects that has on Africa, starting in the last couple of decades of the 19th century.